Welcome to Learning and Teaching Systemic Therapy podcast, the official Society for the Teaching of Marriage and Family Therapy, STMFT in short, podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sofia Georgiadou. My pronouns are she, her. I created STMFT and this podcast as an antidote to the isolation I experienced as an early career academic. I also created STMFT and this podcast as a space to allow myself and my colleagues to share resources and bridge the way we do systemic therapy with the way we teach systemic therapy in our classrooms. Today, I have a fascinating discussion lined up for you. Our discussion features questions I sourced from two PhD and MFT students who could not be with us today, and one early career MFT professor who has recently started navigating the path of academia and is here to share her insights. Here with us today, we have Dr. Lisa Salazar, DMFT, LMFT supervisor, LPC supervisor. Dr. Salazar earned her Master of Arts in Marriage and Family Therapy at the University of Houston Clear Lake in 2003, and her Doctorate of Marital and Family Therapy at Loma Linda University in 2022. She's a first-generation graduate Latina with Mayan roots. She has been married for 31 years, has 2 adult sons, and 1 daughter in high school. She's a rescue mom of 1 very spoiled dog, Joaquin, who often makes a cameo in Zoom meetings. Maybe we will see him today, I don't know. She has worked in schools, a nonprofit sector, medical settings, and has been in private practice for over 15 years. Currently, she's a supervisor for those seeking licensure in Texas for LPC and LMFT, and she's a full-time professor at Yorkville University in Canada, where she works with second and third-year students in the fully online Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology program. When she's not working or reading, you will often find her cheering for her daughter and teammates at volleyball tournaments. Our PhD student who provided most of the questions we will discuss today with Dr. Salazar is Yvonne Judge, IMFTS. Yvonne is an independent marriage and family therapist licensed in the state of Ohio. She's an AMFT approved supervisor and a PhD in MFT student at National University with 2 courses left before she starts her dissertation. She's also the owner of Revitalize You, a small private practice in Ohio. She works with couples using Gottman method coupled therapy, emotionally focused therapy, and EMDR. She also works with individual clients who have trauma using EMDR, hypnosis, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and other family therapy models. Our second PhD student who submitted one of the questions we will discuss later today is Rose Lange from Adler University. In this episode, we'll be exploring some questions that have been pre-sourced from Yvonne and Rose, which will be answered by Lisa, our professor in MFT. I'll be facilitating the conversation by sharing these questions, and I'm excited to hear Lisa's perspectives and lessons learned. So without further ado, let's dive into our first question.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. All right. So Yvonne would like to know, what qualifications did you need to have in order to teach in an MFT program? And I think that's a pretty straightforward question, but sometimes there's certain things that are in the job posts whenever we see them, right? So yeah, your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I have to say, when I entered into the doctorate program, my goal was not to teach. So I did not go the PhD route. I went the DMFT route, which is Doctorate in Marriage and Family Therapy. And that is really designed to for practitioners who want to create programs, develop, work into, some type and so creating programs and really working on that end instead of academia. And so with academia, I really fell into that because I was a teacher assistant for the director of the DMFT program at Loma Linda. And so based on my experience with her and working with her and also being mentored by her, I quickly learned that while you can have all of the educational qualifications, because naturally you do need to have a terminal degree, right? You do need your PhD or doctorate. Most often they want you to come from a KCREP accredited university. Mine is AMFT accredited. It's a COMFT accredited program. And so that was very important for me because of my licenses that I have. And so well, that's important to have. Um, what really helps pull you out of that stack of many applications is really the experience that you bring, the not just the work experience, internship work experience, research experience. So there's lots of moving pieces to it, and it really narrows down to what you're truly looking to teach in that really shapes your experiences and the kind of education and um, you know volunteerism and the roles that you're going to have outside of that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So doctoral degree, if you want to teach in a master's program and above, for sure. Supervisory license, I think also counts. If you've been in private practice or in just clinical practice in general for a while, that clinical experience really matters when you try to enter the academy because it counts for every class you're going to teach. You're going to use that clinical experience, right? So yeah, I agree with you that any opportunities you have to be a teaching assistant like you did, or anything that else that you can seek out in terms of volunteer opportunities within your program, all of those eventually matter in those applications. Um, all right. The second question here is about how is teaching MFTs online versus in person different? And so I know that you went to an in-person program for your master's, but an online program for your DMFT. So now that you're teaching online, I'm wondering how those two experiences are informing your teaching, Lisa.
Yes. So definitely there are different experiences that I had being an in-person student versus an online. What I have uh, learned though is that you can actually cultivate a very similar environment online as you can in person. The difference is that there needs to be intentionality behind it, right? um and in person you're naturally going to see your peers, you're naturally going to be communicating in person with your instructors, and there's a relationship that you naturally develop as a student instructor relationship and peer to peer. And within a cohort that's online, you're more intentional, right? So there's times where you're meeting outside of class, not only just to do group work, but really to just get to know one another. And then also being intentional about reaching out to your instructor and also to, to peers with regards to group work and things like that. So as an instructor, it's very important for me to cultivate that environment. And so I typically will meet with students on the first day of class for every class that I teach. And I do teach skills-based courses online. So these are the courses that are have synchronous and asynchronous components to it. So we are working together on counseling skills. We are working together on developing rapport, therapeutic rapport with clients. And so my one of my first goals is to build the rapport with students. And the way that I do that is really by talking to them about what I intend to do in the class, how I want to be most helpful. And then I also let them know my expectations of them, right? And ways that we can communicate. And then I always encourage the students to get to know one another outside of class. And so they might develop some type of chat group with them, right? And so that to me has been really key in developing this. And I actually like the online component, sometimes even better than in person. And the reason for that is because it really you are meeting with students at different phases in their life. And everyone has different expectations, different responsibilities. So it's been really nice to meet students even that are outside of Canada. And then also, I love meeting students in different time zones. Some of them have different work schedules, and so it's really catering to not only traditional students but non-traditional students who typically may not pursue higher education because of the limitations of going in person.
Yeah.
So that's something that is very key and important to me to consider.
You spoke about intentionality, and so I 100% agree with you, having experiences teaching both in person and online. I also find that I self-disclose more with my students online. It comes more natural through like in-person conversations with my in-person students. But with my online students, I make a point of like posting something about a clinical experience I had or a formative experience I had in my clinical practice, or even, posting something with a picture of me engaging in one of my hobbies, something like that. Anything that can help create a sense of like, this is who I am behind the keyboard, and also inviting them to do the same thing, especially in asynchronous courses. Because in synchronous courses, we still have our kind of meeting times, and we still get to interact with one another, even if it's from the chest up, right? Whatever the Zoom square can capture from a person. So um, there's definitely a big difference in teaching online versus in person. I agree with you, and I wouldn't even be able to compare which one is better, because they both have very strong pros and very strong cons, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I believe that I'm speaking more from my own personal experience when I say the online is better, simply because when I was in my master's program, I was much younger. My children were much younger. They were 4 and 2 when I started the master's program at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. So the classes went around really their schedule. They were in preschool. And then when I went back to work on my doctorate, my daughter was in junior high. We were in the midst of a pandemic. I mean, 2020, COVID happened and everything shut down, but my online schooling didn't. Like, we were still meeting, and it gave me this respite from everything that was going on in the world.
Mm.
And so in many ways, it really became this wonderful, enriching escape for me, because I was learning so much. I was talking with a group that was experiencing everything that I was. And we were still learning and working towards a degree that meant so much to all of us because we're so passionate about our fields. My son, who was in the master's program at the University of New Mexico, the school shut down and he was in person.
Mm.
So he had to move out of his apartment, come home, everything shut down. And then it took time for them to resume courses again. And when they did go back online, and he had to, it was a very immersed experience, because he not only now had to do this online, he had to learn how to do online learning, learning about Canva or whatever else they were using, Canvas. It was just, there was just so much, right? Whereas I was already had that experience. And so I got to see the difference, whereas my schooling didn't end.
Mm.
And I was able to do things around my daughter's homework, her work schedule, her school schedule, because she works a lot with in volleyball. I call it work, but because it is work for her. And so it allowed me to not have to choose
Mhm.
what I was going to do. And in my master's program, I often had to make the decision that I was not going to be able to attend a family function or a birthday party or something because I had class or I had an assignment due. And there was, I had to do so many different things for the class. And it just worked very differently. It just seemed that there was more flexibility that the online offered me as an adult learner.
Mhm. Yeah, 100% agree. Another question by Yvonne was, what are some common challenges that you see your students face in the program where you're teaching right now? Let's talk about that for a moment.
Um, what often I find that the students are experiencing is balancing life with school,
Mhm.
whether it be relationships, work, housing, uh, you know, employment, all those kinds of things. They're still working on all of those, right? And now they're also having to balance their academics. And that has been, I think, one of the largest challenges that they all seem to have in common.
Mhm.
Another one is they want to do so well, right? They have such high expectations of themselves. And while it's understandable because, they're high achievers and we can all relate, right?
Mhm.
Um, this field is not designed for you to be perfect out of the gate. It's not like engineering. It's not like being an English teacher, right?
Sure,
Where
yeah,
there's
yeah.
right or wrong. It's a process. And as we're evolving and as we're growing, our counseling is developing. And so it's kind of hard for them to grapple around that. They
Mm,
want to do everything perfect and do it in the same way, right?
yeah,
And so
absolutely.
my what I often tell students is that I want this to be a time for them to explore different theoretical concepts while they're developing their own counseling style, not losing who they are in that process.
Mhm.
That I don't want them to be all little mini Dr. Minuchins or
Yeah,
tears. I want them to be whoever they are, and that because that's what's going to show up in the room, right? And so we
yeah.
learn to work with who we are in the room and value that.
Yeah, it is very much about cultivating that authenticity and like how can I still be my authentic self and develop my therapy skills as an MFT or as a counselor. Um, I also tell them that this is the time of your career or your training that you want to make the mistakes because the stakes are so low here. You know, when you're dealing with clients down the road, you can be sued, you can be terminated from your practicum side or your employment side. I mean, the stakes are so much higher. You can do harm actually on someone who is in a vulnerable position seeking mental health help, right? So I always tell them consider this like your training gym. Like you can make all of the mistakes here, so you make even less when you get out of here, right? And we're always in the learning mode. So there's not going to be a time where everything, like you said, works perfect. But if you're going to make mistakes, make them in graduate school, from all places that you could make them in your training.
I call mistakes learning opportunities, right?
Yeah.
And I let them know um, that therapy is like carrying a puzzle box, and you just dump the puzzle pieces out on the floor. And when a client comes in, that's what they do. They dump all their pieces, whether it be a 50-piece puzzle or a 200-piece puzzle, it doesn't matter. But regardless, every piece that you choose to pick up in that session is equally important to the next, right? And so just like a puzzle, we all, the corners are important, the inside is important, and no one wants to finish a puzzle and be missing one piece. No one, right? And so that's how, when I let them know, when you are with a client, there are going to be times where when you go back and reflect, you start to think, I should have done this, I could have said this. And I tell them, rather than looking at it as I messed up, look at it as, you know what, I went where the client needed me to go in that moment. And now that I'm reflecting, I can use that in the next session. I noticed that when we were talking about this came up. I'd like to revisit that. And I said, and use those as learning opportunities for you um, to really teach the client themselves that moving forward, sometimes we do kind of take some steps back, right? And that we are to model for our clients what we're really wanting them to do. We can't, a client cannot surpass our growth. So if we are not growing and if we are not willing to look at areas, like you said, that are mistakes or learning opportunities, if we're not willing to look at that, then we're not going to feel comfortable enough in the room to engage the client to do the same.
Great, 100%. I want to move on to the next question by Yvonne, and that is, how much time does your teaching role take, both in class and outside of class? And so I know you have quite the workload. So you can share, however this makes sense to you in terms of like how much time teaching takes for you in and out of class.
Well, as a student, I believe that you get out what you put in, right? And as an instructor, I believe it's equally important. So I don't really ascribe hours to anything. I just look at what am I doing and how did I complete it? And work, being an instructor is not just grading and showing up for classes. It's also, like you said, sharing resources. You mentioned like sharing pictures, sharing ways to connect. So there's things that you do outside of those components to help enrich their learning experience. And then also it's not just about that, but it's also working on your own learning and your own growth, right? So it's going to workshops and conferences, it's going to trainings, it's also working on research. So it's really what you choose to get out of it and what you choose to really help to be part of that shift in our field and to help be a voice. And so it's not, it's really, for me, not just a job. It's something I'm very passionate about. And so it's hard to place a time
Yeah.
to it.
So you're not really tracking your hours. You're seeing this as kind of like your highest calling, your greatest purpose. And so whatever you need to put into it, it goes into it. Is that?
So you set boundaries, right?
Yes.
Families first. My spirituality is very important to me.
Mhm.
So there are some non-negotiables, right?
Okay.
And you have a plate and you look at, okay, what are the non-negotiables? Well, I can't have a marriage of 31 years not cultivating that relationship, right? It's important. And it's important that I am present with my daughter, who is a teenager. And it's important that I'm present at my church because that is my spiritual growth.
Right.
And it's also important to develop that social aspect, right? To have those friendships that are important to you and to your mental well-being. So when we're looking at that, then we're looking at the work piece. We find a way to balance it. And so, yeah, well, hard to put a time frame on it. There's times where it's important that what maybe you would want to do isn't at the level you would want it to be,
Mhm.
but you are okay with that, much like we are with the clients that we see, where we could have done all these different, we could have worked with 3 or 4 puzzle pieces and we only chose one, but that to be okay with what we're able to give, because with what we gave, that was what was sufficient in that moment. So it varies, right?
Yeah, I hear you. It's like just like we meet clients where they are, we meet ourselves, kind of where ourself is, and so filling our cup first, then going into all of these other teaching duties. Flexible hours do matter a lot. Like whenever you have a moment to do something, to to do it, but also prioritizing like family time or spiritual time or personal time. That's very important for um, survival and growth.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, last question comes from another PhD student, Rose Lange from Adler University. She was curious, what is it like teaching for a master's in counseling psychology program as a systemically trained therapist and educator? And so, how do you bring that piece of your training into the classes you teach?
I love that.
Mhm.
I am such an advocate for Bronfenbrenner's model, the biopsychosocial spiritual model. Uh, what I loved when I was a student at Loma Linda University in the DMFT program is that there was a key focus in not just looking at the biopsychosocial, but integrating spirituality into it. And so, with that being said, that's the lens that I work from, right? And when we are looking at just our students alone, that's a system. The cohort is a system. So what we do already is systemic. And it's looking at how does this impact not only the client, but their relationships with others, the community, what gaps in services and treatments are there. So we're continuously looking at that already. We are just now, what we do, or what I do, is I'm just intentional about how we want to be mindful of that, right? It's not, uh, if we're working with a client and they're coming in with some type of chronic illness, well, it's not just about the chronic illness or the depression that they might come in with. It's how is this impacting the relationships you have with others? How has this affected your quality health of life? How is this affecting the real, your spirituality, or where do you draw strength from? What gives you hope? What gives you meaning? And so a lot of what we do already is quite systemic. Even as instructors, we work together. That's a system in of itself.
Yeah. I find myself, because I'm also teaching, as a disclaimer, I'm also teaching for Yorkville University as sessional faculty. I frequently introduce students to systems theory. I talk about how a behavior makes sense if we look at the context. I introduce them to systemic models. Um, I love kind of the cross-pollination that happens because I am systemically trained, but I'm teaching in a counseling psychology program in another country, preparing folks that will become, counselors and therapists, and they might end up working someday with couples and families and individuals using a systemic perspective. So I am planting seeds, I feel, in a lot of ways, with all of the things that I'm sharing. And I'm very transparent about that lens, that this is my training. And, there's 1,000 ways to skin an apple, and this is mine. You don't have to follow it if it doesn't align with yours, but this is kind of what I'm envisioning or visualizing or how I'm conceptualizing a case, right? So yeah, I love to give them little bits and pieces about our line of work and how we work as systemic therapists.
Absolutely. You know, I often go back to Dr. Linda Bell. She was one of the founding members or one of the developers, right, for the University of Houston Clear Lake Master Family Therapy Program. And she really believed that it's not just the client and you, it's they're bringing in people into that room. So even if it's just an individual client, it's really not an individual client because there's others that are sitting in that room with them. And so she loved doing family sculpting. And that was just so amazing. And so there's many ways that as an individual counselor working with individuals can actually be quite systemic because we're looking at how it extends beyond the person.
100%. So
Yeah.
there you have it, folks. I want to say a big thank you to my fantastic guest, Dr. Lisa Salazar, for sharing her experiences and insights on teaching marriage and family therapy. I hope her wisdom and experiences will help our fellow educators and listeners on their own academic career journey. To our listeners, we hope you found today's discussion both enlightening and inspiring. If you're hungry for more conversations like this about teaching systemic therapy, be sure to follow our Learning and Teaching Systemic Therapy podcast episodes on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. We have podcast episodes coming up every month, so stay tuned. And if you're interested in becoming a part of our mission at STMFT, or if you need guidance for your educational aspirations in the field of systemic therapy, please visit our website. Our webpage is stmft.coastmft.org. And consider joining our Facebook group, www.facebook.com/groups/STMFT. Thank you for joining us today. And until next time, keep connecting and learning with colleagues. This is Dr. Sofia Georgiadou signing off for STMFT's Learning and Teaching Systemic Therapy.